be what the hello, now I done it, I love you. Forget be what the hello, now I done it, I love you. Once upon a time, I was looking for a sign. But your mama, show the way, you'll be my guide. Love is undermined, close your eyes and you will find melody, oh melody, I feel the energy inside. Say, all the people coming my way. Love is on my way. Makala kumade, makala kumade, masa, makala kumade.
Shalom, everyone. Welcome, one and all. Tonight, we've got over 300 people registered listening from all over Australia and around the world, indeed. JNF is 120 years old this year, the original and therefore the oldest Zionist organisation in history. For well over a century, JNF's mission has been a very simple one, to ensure Jewish continuity, a sustainable home for the Jewish people in our ancestral home, the land of Israel. And we do that by promoting Jewish identity and a love of Israel in the diaspora, and raising awareness, supporting pioneering and benevolent projects in Israel, connecting with our youth in the Jewish and non-Jewish day schools, and generally by engaging with our community wherever we can in events like tonight. Over the course of the pandemic, we've been running a series of events and webinars, and we've enjoyed them all, and we've met inspiring people that we can relate to, that we can look up to, and hear their stories in order to be uplifted, especially in times like now, that we're all locked down. I'd just like to mention a quick note about the fires that have been in Jerusalem, that have been put out by JNF firefighters, and actually in a JNF forest that we planted 100 years ago. And as soon as it all comes down, we'll be replanting and reforesting all of those areas. I'd also like to ask you to spare a thought from time to time for the families of Oron Shaul and Hadar Golden, whose bodies have been held by Hamas for the last 7 years and are being held hostage, along with Avner Mengistu, who's an Ethiopian with mental health issues that crossed into the border in 2014 and has been held captive ever since. I'd like to thank Maccabi Australia and the Australian Jewish News, who've partnered with us tonight in helping to put the event together. And of course, I'd like to thank our main sponsors, Kelly Partners, Meriton, Matific, the Lowy Foundation, Ash Morgan, and Designer Rugs for helping us do the things that we do. Tonight, I'm delighted to have as our guests two inspiring young Jewish members of our communities, dual Olympian and five-time Australian 400-metre champion Steve Solomon, and recent Olympian and Commonwealth Games gold medalist Jemima Montag. Those of you who would know me well would know that I'm not exactly built for speed. 400 metres would seem like a marathon for me, so I'm quite looking forward to hearing about walking from Jemima. We're also privileged to have Dr. Sarah Kelly, OAM, moderate for us tonight, this evening. Dr. Kelly is a world-renowned sports strategist, professor, philosopher, lawyer, and speaker, and is passionate about sport and its power to impact people, organisations, and society. Among many accolades and roles that she's filled and continues to fill, she's the deputy chair of the board of Brisbane AFL Lions, although of course we would prefer to go for the Swans here in Sydney, and recently has also become the Consul General of the State of Israel in Queensland. Over to you, Sarah.
Oh, many thanks, David, for the generous introduction and also the invitation from yourself and JNF to moderate tonight. I'm very impressed by the incredible work that JNF does under your leadership. It's a fantastic organisation, so happy to be involved here tonight. And, you know, what a privilege to get to have a fireside chat, a post-dinner fireside chat from on Australian time, from here in Brisbane, with many of you in Sydney and around Australia and internationally, I understand, and to welcome back, albeit in quarantine at the moment, our superstar athletes, two from our star performing, I think it's the greatest ever performing Olympics track and field team, Jemima Montag and Stephen Solomon. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you both. Hello. Have we got Jemima's video on? Hello, both of you there in quarantine. So look, welcome both of you, and many thanks for your time. I know even in quarantine, you'll have plenty of people to talk to. Your own study and your bios are absolutely extraordinary, and you know, your leadership on the field, or on the track I should say, as well as off the track, is extraordinary. You two I would classify as pin-up high achieving athletes who lead this dual life of not only being professional athletes and elite athletes, but also you've been able to study, you've been able to develop social entrepreneurial activities that actually benefit broader beyond yourselves and broader society. So we'd love to talk about that tonight. But I just thought, could we just firstly start off with each of you just giving us a few minutes to tell us your story. I think everyone's always keen to find out, you know, Stephen, yourself, you know, how you came to end up an elite athlete. What is it that made you actually do that? Your upbringing from Sydney, and Jemima, you as well. So I don't mind who goes first. Perhaps Jemima, you could go first.
Sure.
Tell us your story.
Okay, so I am what they call a Macca baby. My parents met at Maccabea. Lovely little aeroplane romance. Dad had someone sitting next to him and he felt like getting up and moving, and there was a spare seat next to a nice looking lady, and they hit it off, exchanged phone numbers, and had 3 kids who they signed up to all sorts of sports. I really was a generalist growing up, and I could have pursued a number of different areas. I also really love music, played a few instruments. We had a different sport every night of the week. Little athletics happened to be one of them, but I also enjoyed about a decade of ballet. And I was really encouraged to enjoy my childhood and really not take sport or anything too seriously. So I'd be saying no thank you to altitude training camps while I was younger, so that I could go down to the beach house in Blairgowrie with my family and do nippers and normal things. And I think that was one of the things I was grateful for early on, just keeping it broad, keeping it general, making it about enjoyment and making friends. And I think that meant that by the time I was 17 or 18 and it was time to start thinking about getting rid of some of these activities and dialing in on 1 or 2, I was full of energy and I was ready to do it. I wasn't burnt out. My body was rearing to go. It was strong. I'd laid a really great foundation over those childhood years. And that's when I decided that I had this unique opportunity to put on this uniform and represent Australia at the Olympics. I'd certainly had my challenges and my struggles through the later years of high school with confidence and not quite believing that I had what it took. But a special family holiday to Japan 5 years ago set off a little light bulb in my mind that maybe returning to Japan this year would be possible. I had to make a number of changes to my environment to transition from a junior to a senior athlete, from that year 12 girl who had really low self-esteem and didn't quite believe it would be possible. I had to change coaches. I had to make a number of sacrifices and find that balance with uni and other things. I tried in my first semester of university to have a full-time study load, train like a senior athlete, work a number of jobs, and sort of have a red hot social life at the same time, and it came crashing down. So I learned that lesson the hard way, as I have done throughout my entire life so far. I don't really take advice on board very well, and I like to stuff up and then learn. So I then had to learn to scale uni back, create that balance, and 4 years later, here we are.
Oh, well done. I think even to find that, to have the maturity and the resilience to actually find that balance. So we'd really love to talk more about that. But what an extraordinary life you've had already, and you're so young, amazing. And you haven't even mentioned some of your off track, some of the charities you've set up and social entrepreneurial activities. So we'll hear about that later. But thanks, Jemima. And Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I follow a very similar path to Jemima. I had a very eclectic childhood. I grew up painting my face green and gold, supporting the Wallabies, hoping to be a Wallaby one day. And unfortunately, everyone else grew and I didn't seem to grow. So then I went to soccer and thought I wanted to play for Manchester United. And then everyone else seemed to be better than me. So I went to cricket and swimming and tennis, and then eventually I found running. So running was always something for me that I enjoyed, but it was kind of just like a tangent thing that helped me be a better sportsman on the pitch in soccer and rugby. And it wasn't until late into high school that I started to kind of take running seriously. And, you know, part of me taking it seriously, I went to Cranbrook High School, and my coach there was a guy named James Roth, and he became a good friend and mentor. And I think, like in everyone's journey, and I'm sure Jemima will touch on it later today, you have these people who become kind of key figures in shaping your destiny or your path. And James was one of those for me. And my kind of trajectory in athletics was a very quick one. I went from kind of breaking school records and winning school races to all of a sudden in grade 10, you know, winning inter-school races, breaking those records. That qualified me for the New South Wales Championship. So I went there and I won that championship, which qualified me for the Australian All Schools Championship, to which I went and won there as well. So it was a very quick kind of rise into the 400 meters. I think a large part of that is when you play soccer 6 days a week for 10 years of your life, you kind of get a bit of speed and endurance and hip flexor strength and all the other things that make you a good 400 meter runner. And so I went and started training with James, and then it got to the point where James actually introduced me to his coach, which was a woman by the name of Vera Devoskina. She was a refugee from the Ukraine who spoke a hybrid of Russian English, which meant for the first 3 months, I didn't know anything that Vera was saying. But thankfully, running is a primal movement. So she was able to show me with her body kind of what she was saying, and our translation skills improved and our relationship improved. And Thera took me from a school champion to an Olympic runner in about 2 years. So it was her kind of love and care and the continual support of my family that allowed me to kind of pursue it started as a talent and became a profession. And I've just been very lucky now to have been competing in the uniform now for 10 years and still doing so with great excitement and energy.
Absolutely extraordinary, your career. When we see, I think you're now 6 times Australian champion, multiple Olympics. I think it was London your first Olympics, 2012. Yeah. So right. Absolutely extraordinary. And both of you have done us all proud, all of your communities and the Australian community, I should say as well. We're just so proud of you. I'm starstruck, as you can see tonight. Hey, I think first up, I think just hearing both of those stories, one really interesting question that I would certainly have is, what does it take? What's the one thing in particular you can think of that it took to take that step to your elite level? From, say, winning nationals, becoming an Australian champion, to actually making that even further step to the Olympic world level?
To me, it took a taste of the experience. So I was able to compete for Australia on junior teams, and my first junior team was in 2010. It was an under-20s team, and I was 16 at the time. And we went to a competition, a world junior competition, and it was at that championships where I got to look at for the first time, the best in the world at this sport that was very new to me. And it was at that point that I realized that I didn't want to be on the bench. I wanted to be in the final. I wanted to be on the podiums. And it was kind of that experience that gave me the will to get to the top. And then it was my environment that I had with Thera and what we called Team Thera that gave me then the experience and the skills to be able to manage to get there. But it was definitely seeing it with my own eyes that casted this desire to get to the top. What about you, Jem?
So I had a bit of a moment on that family holiday in Japan that I alluded to earlier. I'll give a summary because I've said this so many times, but my younger sister basically said, this country is amazing. They're hosting the next Olympics. Do us a favor and make that team so that the family can come back and eat more sushi. And I didn't
hard to live in, yeah.
I'm not sure why she didn't consider being the one to be the athlete, because she was a fantastic gymnast and diver, but anyway, it had to be me. So there were two things really that had to change for me to make that junior to senior transition and achieve this goal 5 years later. And it was to do with what's outside and what's inside. So what's outside is that I had to build a high performance environment around me. And that's to do with people in my support network. So I had to have family and friends on board, and then building other people into it. So it's an individual sport, but we've all got psychologists, dietitians, strength and conditioning coaches, actual coaches, etc. And then the built environment. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to live a kilometre from St Kilda and Elwood Beach Path, and only a 10-minute drive to the Victorian Institute of Sport. So those things to do with the physical environment were really important, as well as the people in my environment. And in terms of what's inside, for me, that move to high performance was about self-awareness and continuous reflection. So I think achieving high performance in an individual sport requires us to try things, realize they don't really work for my body or my mind, and extract lessons and continue to build forward. So I had to be really passionate about self-improvement to get to where I am now. So outside and inside.
So that growth mindset, you could say. And actually, that's really interesting. So while you're just on that sort of mindset and, you know, what it takes in terms of your personality and your willpower, I suppose, your resilience in learning from those failures you just mentioned as well. Is it for you two, you're completely different events, even though you're both track and field athletes, you couldn't get more different events in the two of you right here tonight. So it would be quite interesting to understand the difference in the sort of mindset that a 400-meter sprinter brings to the track, where in my very armchair rudimentary understanding, and I must say many Australians have become experts of every sport after watching that Olympics, there's no margin for error at all, Steve. Whereas with you, Jemima, you're more an endurance mindset from what I understand. So it must be completely different going into those events. Can each of you explain that difference a little bit more for the rest of us?
Definitely. I'll start because Jemima and I were talking about this actually only a few days ago.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. You know, the 400, you know, it's one lap of the track. You know, it's 43, 44, 45 seconds of focus. You know, it's an event where you're fatigued by your generation of lactic acid. So your body starts to shut down on you with the byproducts that it builds up through exercise. So for me, when you're in the performance, you know, it's 45 seconds. And what we end up doing as 400-meter sprinters is we go into this like deep, intensive, almost meditative focus. So when the gun goes, you're just so in your own zone that it kind of carries you throughout the race. And it's when you run a good race is when you don't actually have any perception of what's going on around you. You have like a little bit of awareness of where you're positioned in the race. But as soon as you kind of crack your focus away from, you know, this deep tunnel vision, that's when the body kind of goes into its primal instincts of panic. Like, why are we running? Why are we sprinting? Why are we feeling, you know, all this lactic acid in the body? And all of a sudden your shoulders become earrings and you start leaning back and then, you know, everything crumbles. So that's kind of the 400 meters. It's very much, you know, you got to run your own race. And I think that's what makes it so exciting is, you know, from a spectator looking in, you're able to take an assessment of where different runners are at different points in the race. And you're starting to try and formulate your own idea of what's their strategy, how they're doing. And then in my lane as the athlete, I'm oblivious to everything else that's going on. So it's probably much more exciting for you to watch a 400 meters and to run one, both because it's not as taxing on the body, but also because you get to see the whole race play out. Whereas for me, it's so tunnel vision. I'm just so focused on my own race.
Extraordinary. That is and I thought it was really interesting that I think your post run interview on the television went for longer than the race. You were able to recover so quickly I think you spoke for over 60 seconds, whereas the race, of course, was 44 or something. So
I think that's the cruelest part of athletics, is that they treat us like tennis players and think that we can interview immediately after a race.
Tough. You did well, though, I'd have to say, and most of you did. It was extraordinary. I don't know how they do that, having this microphone on world television in front of you immediately after a race. Very tough. Jemima,
and with a mask on,
Sarah. What was that?
And with a mask on, we were
yes,
out of breath. And we were like this, and we were trying to breathe.
Very tough.
Had to happen. So yes, we have opposite events from a mindset point of view. I guess all of the sprinting events, when people were watching on TV, you would have seen that the mental side of it and the mind games, as Steve was touching on a couple of nights ago in another talk we did, they really happen in the call room, or when the camera starts zooming in on each person announcing, you've got everyone doing their little hey miss my family, whatever. That's all the theatrics of it, getting into each other's head. The race walkers don't really do that, and the mental stuff starts once the gun goes. So I really see it that once my race starts, it's all about the mental dialogue. All of the physical preparation is done. And yes, it is a physical exercise for an hour and a half, but your body knows what to do. And it's so much just on muscle memory and what you've prepared for, that this guy is really what's going to control your outcome. So there's a lot of little games that happened throughout my race. It was pretty argy-bargy. You had to really own your own personal space, especially around the drinks tables. There were a couple of people doing naughty things like knocking all of the other water bottles over after they'd taken one, or throwing their empty water bottle down at your feet to try and trip you. And you've really got to be able to not let any of those games get to you. I remember at my first senior international experience hearing the Russians communicating in their language and the Spaniards communicating in their language as we went around the course. And I was just like, what is going on? So I do a lot of work with 2 different sports psychologists, and I have to try and, rather than take a cognitive control strategy approach where every negative thought that pops into your head, you try and squash it out of the way and wish it never popped up. It's the stance that we expect unhelpful thoughts to come about, because what we're doing, as Steve was saying before, is biologically, it doesn't make much sense. Like to race walk at 4 minutes 25 per kilometer for an hour and a half is not necessarily what humans were built to do. And so my brain is going to start feeding me pain narratives, and that's all they are later in the event. So what I'm really trying to learn and to teach myself is that those pain stories that my brain will tell me are not necessarily indicative of acute tissue damage. Not actually tearing my hamstrings off, or my feet aren't actually on fire, or whatever else I'm telling myself. They're just a sign of metabolic pain and discomfort. And teaching myself that discomfort is uncomfortable and it's annoying, but it's not dangerous. And it's something that I can sit with and breathe through, and just bringing myself back to focus on more mindful things like technique and what I'm here to do in terms of game plan has been really handy. So I'm basically talking to myself for an hour and a half.
That's extraordinary. That is really interesting, Jemima. And I did read that part, and you might want to talk about that now as well, the social entrepreneurship activity that you're involved in. And a lot of it is centered around mindfulness. So you're a huge advocate of mindfulness. Is that right?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is Blue Earth.
Yes.
And I'm their ambassador. Yeah, so Blue Earth is an organization set up to enhance the physical education system that's already in place in primary schools. I guess in PE, we learn skills, we learn how to play basketball, footy, tennis, the rest. But there's not much physical literacy that comes in there. And physical literacy is all about how we move well and mindfully and connect with others, etc. So Blue Earth can come into primary schools and I can be there with them to, it's almost a mixture of mindfulness, yoga, and that physical activity to really get the kids tuning into how their bodies move and how they interact. And it can have some incredible outcomes on the kids. You can see 2 kids who you know, their body language at the beginning of the
Yeah.
class was showing that they had a bit of an issue with each other, or there was some sort of social hierarchy going on. And then through this mindful physical activity, they're best buds by the end, and they're holding hands and whatever. So it's an important, thing to do with young people.
Oh, that's one. And even those skills that you've both talked about, actually just sitting here listening to you, I'm thinking, gee, there's a lot. You guys can go out and do workshops with business, with parents, with kids, with whoever it may be out there would benefit from that kind of insight. I think when you are under what could be termed extreme pressure at that elite sporting level, I think there's a lot of lessons we can take away from that mindset that is involved in actually controlling some of the biological reactions that occur in those situations. And Steve, do you find, I do note you've studied at Stanford and Duke University, which is very impressive. So it'd be interesting, how did those two campuses compare in terms of being a campus athlete? And in terms of the studies you've done, I understand you've studied business as well as the pre-med degree. So talk us through that experience.
Definitely. Before I get on to Stanford and Duke, I'll touch on one of the things that you just said before, because it's so true, kind of what Jemima was saying, and the ability for sport to kind of teach you mindfulness, to give you focus. You know, meditation is a big word that's used today, but we all have meditated before. It's called playing sport. It's about being in the moment. And, you know, a lot of parents, especially Jewish parents, come to me and say, Steve, my daughter or my son, they're not going to be an Olympian. Like, they're pretty bad athletically. Like, maybe you could suggest that they focus more on their study and less on their sport. And I always think that would be the worst advice I could ever give them, because the skills that you develop on the sporting field, whether you take it to an elite level or not, are some of the most important foundational skills that you'll ever have as a person. You know, learning time management when you're doing a lot of things, understanding how to lose, and how to work towards something for years and it not to come to fruition, how to recover from injury, how to celebrate as a team, how to look after one another. Like, all of these lessons can't be learned in another environment. I'm convinced sport is the best environment. And what makes it so enjoyable is that it's fun and it's social and it's engaging and it's physically hard, and you have that sense of accomplishment because you've physically gone through it. So I think it's an amazing organization that Jemima's involved with there, bringing that to the school kids. That's fantastic. In terms of study, I had two great opportunities over in America. It was actually, I was planning on going over to the States after my last year of high school and visiting a couple of the campuses, meeting with the coaches, kind of getting a sense of what the US system was like. But I sustained an injury and I wasn't able to travel. And it was actually my father, Michael, who was going over to the States on business. And he said, okay, I'm in California. I'll pop into a couple of the universities and kind of check him out for you. And he came back and he just had this look in his eye and said, if you can get into Stanford, he's like, it made me want to go back to study. So somehow I slipped in, and the university was just a magnificent experience. I met Mark Zuckerberg before I even started school. I had 3 of my mates drop out in the freshman year to found a company. The entrepreneurial spirit there was amazing. It took me from coming into university with this idea that I would exit and go and pursue medicine, but I just fell in love with technology and entrepreneurship and management and everything that came about there. And that's one of the benefits of the American system. So when you go over to America, you don't apply to a degree, you apply to a university. And then once you're at university, you can take any class the university has on offer. So although I was a human biology major, I took psychology classes, I took economics classes, I took computer science classes, I took math classes. Everything was available to you. And that was just a tremendous experience and opportunity for me. And how Duke came about was I was getting to the end of applying to medical school and realizing that, it's not really what I want to do anymore. But I kind of need to do a litmus test as a trained scientist to make sure it wasn't a product of my environment being at Stanford that made me want to pursue technology. It was, more than that. So I went and had a wonderful experience at Duke. Had an amazing athletic coach at Duke who became a really close friend. And it was just a great overall experience. So if anyone's on the call who's contemplating or thinking about going to the US, whether it's for undergrad or postgrad, you've got my encouragement with both hands.
And Steve, I think I mentioned earlier that it was my son actually graduated from UCLA last year as a track and field middle distance athlete. And he recalls racing you at the Armory in the indoor track in New York one year, and has followed your career closely, because I think he's now, he's quite inspired. I think he's going to get the spikes back on and have a crack at the 400. So
please, we need some more teammates.
But it is a tremendous experience, isn't it? I think that collegiate experience, the NCAAs are probably, up there as the next tier below the Summer Olympics. So great experience. And Jemima, tell us about your studies and your life around your sport. What is it you fit in, other than being an ambassador, as we've mentioned, that you've done some study as well? Have you picked that up again?
So I finished a Bachelor of Science with a physiology major last year. And
well done.
thank you. And I was all set to start postgrad of medicine, but I delayed it for a year when the Olympics were postponed, just to go all in on these games.
Very well.
Yeah, I'm glad I did. I think that would have been an interesting juggle. But it was that postgrad will start in February. So I'm looking forward to that. That'll be 4 years, but realistically for me, it'll be 5 or 6, given that I'll likely take a year off again for the Paris Olympics, and we'll see where it takes me. Outside of study and sport, this year I was really excited to be named one of the IOC young leaders for the next 4 years. So the International Olympic Committee chose 25 people. We went through about a 6-month process of a bit of onboarding and interviews and selection. And we come from all over the world, and it's really exciting because basically we've all been given the challenge to build a sport-based social business that tackles a pressing local issue in our communities that we're passionate about. They've given us a bit of seed funding and mentorship over the next 4 years. This year, year 1 is all about research. Next year, we'll be launching some sort of pilot and then scaling it and seeing if we can make it sustainable enough to step away and have the social business just run. So my pressing local issue that I'm passionate about is the decline in participation for young women and girls in sport and physical activity. It was something that I experienced as a young girl. A number of barriers, both socio-cultural and in the built environment, that made me really question whether I had a place on the sporting field, to the point of really stepping away as a year 11 and 12 student. And I don't think I would have gotten back into it if my sister hadn't said, how about another family holiday to Japan? So I guess I was lucky to have her and also to have the belief and support from mum, and then the next dominoes that fell. But I am really keen to work on this area. So this has just been my research year. I've been really just focusing on what the barriers are to young women and girls in sport, and what we can do to tackle them. So the main barriers so far have really been uniform-induced body confidence issues, concerns for personal safety, just on a gender by gender basis, sporting facilities that either haven't been updated since the 80s or haven't been built with women in mind and our specific needs, different socio-cultural expectations for young boys versus young girls. And I remember specifically how we spend our time at lunchtime. That was a big deal. How acceptable it is to come back to the next class all sweaty and muddy from potentially playing soccer or footy at lunchtime for the boys versus the girls. And then other things like peer pressure and that physical literacy that I mentioned earlier. So I think my project is going to be school-based. I want to come in, and we've been learning all about human-centered design, which is basically where, rather than thinking that you've got the solution for your target audience, you actually empower them and equip them with the skills to solve their own issue. So I want to come into schools, build leadership teams of young girls in their later years of high school, and let them take charge and build their own much more inclusive and enjoyable sporting environments. So that's the project. And I think I often get questions about the juggle struggle, how to do all these things at once. And my coach puts it pretty simply. He says, happy athletes train and perform well. And I think having study and hobbies like cooking and piano and this IOC thing mean that I'm looking after my mental health. And regardless of what happens each day in training, I've got an escape from training. And I think that's really key. Just one final point on that, something we're all working on at the moment. We heard from Hugh from the Resilience Project the other day.
Oh, excellent.
And he was trying to teach the Australian Olympic team about how elite performers often struggle to disentangle their performance and their identity. So sometimes we fall into this trap of believing that unless we produce incredible results on the track, we aren't worthy of the pride of our families, love, respect, etc. But building identities outside of sport, like Steve and I and a number of other athletes have done, can help us enter competitions and training sessions know that our sporting success is amazing and it's a bonus. And that's what we train so hard for. But what counts is who we are as a person and all of those other things that we're doing. So I think having a number of things going on is really important on a number of levels.
Both of you are just fantastic ambassadors and advocates for this sort of side to, well, I suppose it's a dark side to elite sport in general and professional sport as well, where, we are seeing reports and studies recently published around concern around athlete well-being, athlete mental health as well, and that athletes as an adverse selection who actually are very susceptible to mental health issues in particular, and especially at those pressure points where they're maybe elevating from a kind of second tier athlete to an elite selection and they're undergoing that sort of stress, or they're transitioning out of their athletic career as well. What you're doing is absolutely fantastic. So look, you have a lot of support out there for what you're trying to achieve. And I must say that the women and girls in sport piece is absolutely critical. I think we're seeing with these young girls dropping out of sport at a younger age than their colleagues, their male colleagues. It is a real concern. So anything you can do, Jemima, to assist with that through this enterprise is outstanding. So credit to you, and to you as well, Steve. I know you do so much for others outside of your sport as well. So do you want to talk us through some of your plans into the future? I think both of you as well. I mean, one thing I know, we've got the announcement just before you went or while you were over there of the successful Brisbane 2032 Olympics and Paralympics hosting. So I know I'm wearing my maroon colour tonight just to really annoy a lot of the Southerners, but seriously, we're very, very proud, I think, as a nation and a state and a city to be hosting these huge events and so many other mega events coming through in the next decade. So how are you excited about this successful announcement, and what will both of you be doing in 2032? What's next?
I can't tell you what I'm going to be doing exactly in 2032, but I can tell you what I'll be doing in the lead up. And, for my immediate future, I'll continue to run, I'll continue to work. So I work at Uber on the Uber Eats side of the business and have for the last 3 years and have been loving it. As you get later into your career, a few things change. Your body physically changes, but more than that, your motivation for why you continue to put yourself through hell changes. Jemima just spoke beautifully before of it was this trip to Japan that kind of sparked this flame to make an Olympics. Sorry, Jem, you won't have that for the next one in Paris. So and I found that as well. You end up changing why you run and what running means to you. And we're all a product of time. The opportunity cost of our time is always going to be what's competing against our desires. So for me, like Jemima so brilliantly said, a happy athlete is a successful one. So as long as I remain happy and am enjoying what I'm doing and still learning and still feeling like I'm improving and being able to deliver experiences for myself and my friends and my family and my coaching staff, then I'll keep going. But at the same time, very much looking forward to at some point taking all this time and energy and putting it to another focus is also something that's important to me. But that's actually been very empowering as well. I was, You know, one of the people I love following was Sir Alex Ferguson, you know, maybe the greatest football manager of all time. And if you read his book, he said that he doesn't think anyone in the EPL has ever completed a degree while playing in the EPL. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to speak to a guy called Tim Brown, who was a professional soccer player and is now the CEO of a $1 billion shoe company. And what he was saying is, he always had a plan to go and study, and he went to go study an MBA at the London School of Economics when he finished, because that was giving him the power to make the decision of if he wanted to keep playing football. Because unfortunately in sport, your decision to stop isn't always your choice. You know, often you get dropped from a team, or you stop making teams, or injury takes that, forces you into retirement. So it's really important to continue to give yourself choice. And while I'm continuing to choose to run, I'm really enjoying it. So I don't know where I'll be in 2032, likely not on the athletics track, but hopefully in the stands, losing my voice for the next crop of 400-meter runners.
Well, I do hope, you know, we all have you close to the fold in being just great ambassadors, great Australians. And look, Steve and Jemima, I'm just monitoring the chat as well. We have so many questions coming through from the audience, so we might go to some of these questions. One that's coming out, and one I'd like to ask as well, is, you know, when you're faced with, you know, you're going to Tokyo, how did the AOC help support you with some of the, I guess, some of the negative news around the COVID pandemic happening there, the state of crisis that Tokyo was in at the time you were flying over there? How did they help equip you with that quite unusual or extraordinary situation?
Jem, do you want to give this one a go? Otherwise, I'm happy to.
I'll have a go. So we were receiving a series of what they were calling playbooks from the Tokyo Olympic Games Organizing Committee and the IOC. So that was sort of drip feeding us little pieces of the puzzle, and we were slowly getting a better picture of how they were going to execute the impossible and pull off a COVID-safe games now, which is crazy that they did, and they were successful. I mean, not a single Australian had a COVID issue in the end. So
it was incredibly well run by the looks of it from our perspective, wasn't it?
Yeah. So we were slowly having those playbooks sent in by the AOC, and they were also offering support via Zoom, these sorts of sessions where those playbooks would be explained. But no doubt it was a challenging time, that 12 months with the postponement, because as you can imagine, we saw that the stats that 85% of the Japanese population didn't want the games to be on. We saw the pictures of the protests going on over there. We read the news. Well, I tried not to every day when all of that negativity around the games, how it was irresponsible to be going ahead, how the world wasn't ready, how they shouldn't go ahead, and it was quite exhausting, to the point where a couple of times I had to actually put my hand up in the middle of conversations with people and say, I really can't engage in this conversation anymore, because I'm trying to wake up every day and put my head down and train morning and afternoon towards this thing that I'm not even sure is going to be going ahead. I mean, we as athletes didn't really know much more than the general public as to the certainty or not of the games. And honestly, until that gun went off, I couldn't have even told you for sure that it was going to go ahead, because there were so many things up in the air. Even when we were at the games, if you were a close contact of someone else who had COVID, or obviously if you yourself contracted it, they would have pulled you out of competing. So there were a number of question marks, and it was a challenging time, but I think the AOC, they did a pretty good job. What do you think, Steve?
I think they did a great job, and I think Jemima kind of hit all the nails on the head there. For me, you know, the whole year was riddled with rumors around the Olympics and if they go ahead, and it makes sense intuitively to think that we got stressed out by it. But like Jemima said, we didn't engage with it, because whether it went ahead or not was kind of irrelevant to us. We had to assume that it was. So we just treated our training and our preparations and everything like that off that assumption. And the great shame of the whole games is that only the athletes got to realize how fantastic they were. Japan did a sensational job. And, you know, I have had the opportunity to go to London and compare, and, you know, the quality of the facilities and the volunteers and the village, you know, it was all just top shelf. So, you know, such a credit to the Japanese and the IOC as well, because they would have been feeling immense pressure. And I don't envy them at all throughout the entire campaign. But if you remember watching the games and seeing the reaction of the athletes, you know, crying, like that primal sense of like accomplishment and the tears and joy with the families and the way that it brought communities together. You know, I'm brought back to Peter Bowl, the 800-meter runner from Australia. And if any of you saw the viral videos of his family, you know, to be able to deliver that experience, what else can do that but sport? So it was an amazing job. And like Jemima said, we kept very COVID safe. Of course, with large numbers, they're going to be very small incidences, and there were, but everyone masked up, everyone vaccinated, everyone sanitized, and we all returned to Australia, you know, happy and healthy.
Yeah, no, and credit to you guys too, and maybe all that the training of the mind and the resilience that you've had as an elite athlete is, you know, it's just yet another hurdle that you can deal with. Whereas I think a lot of us, the average citizens out there, would have melted down. I think credit to you. And I think we were living every moment with our athletes over there. I can tell you that. And as you pointed out, Steve, those emotional moments when athletes finish. And I actually said to my family, you know, we were unpacking what the highlights were. The highlights weren't necessarily at all the gold medal wins. A lot of them were bronze medals. A lot of them were your own races. Peter Bowl's race, as you said too, you know, they were the highlights, and a lot of it was all about that emotion and watching an athlete who is obviously the best in the world, you know, and in our country, the joy you could see on their faces, the relief that they were finally competing. I just thought it was probably the best Olympics in my life anyway that I've witnessed for that reason. So yeah, credit to you for that. And just on that too, we'd love to hear more about the village. And in fact, there's a few questions here. Did you get to interact with many of these Israeli athletes, for instance?
I'll speak a little bit more about the village because I spent my time in Tokyo and Jem spent a lot of her time in Sapporo. Right. So the Olympic Village, you know, it's just like a modern day city. It's like a miniature version of a city. So the hairdressers are there, the nail salons are there, the polyclinics are there, the dining halls there, and you know, it's like just a little city. So what was different around these games is everyone was wearing masks everywhere, and you couldn't help but stay a little bit further away from, you know, some of the other countries. You're like, oh, I don't know what their COVID protocols are, but you know, the village was fun in terms of mixing with athletes. This Olympics, not so much, just because COVID was such a front of mind thing. Like you didn't know where other countries had come from. You didn't know what the policies were within their own camp. You didn't know who they were interacting with. So just from a risk mitigation strategy, you didn't do a lot of interacting. But the village is so much fun because everyone's in their country colors. So like you'll never find a better people watching spectacle than the Olympic Games, because everyone's walking around, you're trying to be like, wonder what sport they do and then what the country they're from. And one of the most enjoyable parts of the games is everyone has pins. Like all the countries have these little pins and you go trade them. So by the end of the games, you end up with a lanyard full of the pins of all other countries in the world. So that's like a fun part of the village. And then yeah, Jem, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experiences at Sapporo and even coming back into the village I know you spent at least one night there.
Yeah, so they did move the marathon and the race walk over to Sapporo, which was an hour and a bit in the airplane north, and they did that to try and get us out of the hot weather, but that failed because it was just as hot. It was 34 degrees.
While you're speaking, Joanne, we'd love to hear that. How did you handle the heat? It is extraordinary heat at that time of year. We could see it.
I'll give you a quick physiology lesson woven into this answer. So 34 degrees, 70% humidity on my start line. For the last year, or the last 4 years really, we've been doing a lot of heat prep because the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games were hot, the Doha Track and Field World Championships were hot. There's just been a lot of sweating going on in my life for the last few years. So we actually installed a sauna at home in January, because with the situation, I can't go and access other saunas. We did a lot of training in a climate chamber at the Victorian Institute of Sport, which is basically a hot room cranked up to race conditions with treadmills inside, where we would train 3 or 4 times a week. The marathoners were also doing rugged up runs where you, in Cairns at our pre-camp, they would go on a run with 3 jumpers on, and that's just crazy. We didn't do
Sounds like
that.
the Rocky. You guys are probably too young to remember, but the Rocky movie when he was training with all the Anyway,
that's more a weight loss thing, but yeah. And then once all the heat training was done, it was about physiology interventions that would help us to pre-cool and stay as cold as possible for as long as possible. So there were about 4 of those. First thing I did was hyperhydration. So we mixed a magical potion, a bit over a litre, made up of glycerol, salt, and Powerade. Basically a super concentrated solution, which means that I drink it 3 hours before the race. My cells absorb it all, nothing passes out, and it gives me a bit of a buffer zone so that even if I am going to sweat 2 or 3 liters during the hour and a half race, I'm not dehydrating myself to a dangerous point where I might be fainting and core temperature rising. That was number 1. Number 2, I sat in an ice bath for half an hour before the start line, which meant I was cooling down while my competitors were warming up.
Slow down there, Jem. You sat in an ice bath for 30 minutes.
Yep.
Before she raced.
There is a very funny video of me trying to smile and then just pulling this absolute resting bee face because I was so cold in there and my teeth were chattering, but I'd practiced it in Doha and I knew it would work. So even though I couldn't feel my feet on the start line, I knew that 30 minutes in, when the others were starting to cook, I would be just feeling excited that I was feeling my toes again. The next thing we did during the race.
Sorry to interrupt. Were you the only one who used that strategy at the beginning?
So it was incredible to see how far ahead Australian sports science is compared to the rest of the world. I can honestly tell you, I had Professor Louise Burke helping me, who's one of our leading sports dietitians. And honestly, every other country had an ice vest. That's about all. But they were doing long warm-ups for half an hour while I was in this ice bath. They wouldn't have hyperhydrated. And the other 2 things I did was I had menthol flavored gels, energy gels during the race. So I'm sure everyone's had that moment where you're brushing your teeth, you take a bit of a breath and you're like, wow, it is cold in my mouth. So that plays into the sensory perception of being cold when you're not actually cold. So
that's really interesting.
One of the energy gel brands called Goo are manufacturing menthol flavored gels. So you take your energy gel, you get your energy, but you also get the cooling effect for the next minute or so while you're breathing. Your brain thinks you're cold, but you're not actually. Anyway, so that's how I coped with the heat. And I was actually thrilled when I saw how hot it was going to be, because I knew that it's my superpower now. I've prepared for it. You also use a lot of mental strategies in the heat by convincing yourself that heat is uncomfortable but not dangerous if you've prepared for it physiologically. And I was excited to see how long I could last. And I think in the end, for about 15 kilometers, I felt really comfy. I felt great. Loved it. Wasn't even feeling hot. And my coach was yelling from the sidelines. He was saying they're all cooked. They've got the pain face on. You've got to stay in that lead pack. And unfortunately, the change of pace in the last 4 kilometers, the eventual winner started really speeding up, and that did. I still don't think I felt hot. I just felt out of breath, and my legs were hurting. But
that's a really interesting preparation. Steve, so the sprinters, you're really different. You have to be warm, obviously.
We have to be warm as well. For those who know me will know that I don't cope well with heat. So while Jemima was hoping that it was very hot, I was hoping that suddenly a cool front would sweep over Japan. For the day of my first race, it was 39 degrees before you take into account humidity. So it was so hot on the track that they poured water for the starting blocks because you didn't want to burn your hands. It was that hot. And, so I would severely reduce my warm up, spend a lot more time on the physio table, having other people help me get mobile instead of doing my own drills. I had my coach Penny running back and forth to get me ice, to which I would hold with both hands while I was doing the entire warm up. And then like Jemima was saying, a lot of the athletes were doing, I just wore an ice vest. It's funny, usually you walk into a competition and like psychologically you put your jacket on, you put your track pants on, like it's kind of, all right, I'm going. But I walked in shirtless with an ice vest on and in my uniform, and I just wanted to be as cool as possible because it was so blistering hot. And the first thing I did when I walked out the track was identify where the water was at the finish line because I knew that I'd be needing it.
It certainly looked hot on the screen. It just, yeah, so that, yeah, very interesting to hear about those strategies. And look, I'm just conscious of the time too. This is just, we could talk for another hour. I had so many other questions to ask you. But David, I think you wanted to do a bit of a wrap. Do we have time for a couple of questions if anyone wants to come online and turn their video on and ask a question? Or I've been going through most of the chat. Before you wrap, David?
But certainly doesn't bother me. I could also listen all night.
Well, there's a couple of other questions, and will I go through one more?
Sure.
Bring it on.
We'll get you to do the wrap. Yeah, so I think one was, I mean, a few people are really wanting to know, did you get to march in the opening or the closing ceremony? And this related to that, what was it like if you did, you know, competing without crowds? Did it change it for someone like you, Steve? Both of you have been to mega events.
So the opening closing ceremonies, neither Jemima and I were both in Australia at the time of the opening ceremony. So that was a really weird experience, sitting on the couch watching the opening ceremony with my girlfriend and my family and my dog, Luna, from home.
Is that the golden retriever you've talked about? Yeah,
that's right. But in terms of what it's like competing in a stadium without crowds, you know, London, there was about 100,000 people in the crowds, and it was so loud in the stadium that before you are able to go out in the stadium, you go into what they call a call room. That's like where all the athletes marshal under the stadium. What you start to realize when you start competing at major events is there's actually an under the stadium, which I never knew as a kid.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you can, like, the whole under the stadium is available for access. And so while we were down there, the floor was the same material as the track. It was like what they call tartan or mondo. And it was so loud in London that the 8 plastic chairs for each of the runners in the final were shaking before you could stand on them under the stadium. So the noise was electrifying. The photo finish camera couldn't take a still image at the London Olympics for when Mo Farah crossed the line in the 5K. So the noise is amazing. But so there is so much the crowd brings, but as an athlete competing on the track, you take it in for like not even a full second when you walk out there, and then you go back into your focus zone. And then I think where we really missed the energy and vibe of the crowd in Tokyo was for the medal ceremonies and for if you won an event. You know, that's where you get to do the victory lap and everyone's cheering at you and you're cheering at them. That's a really special thing. And then the other point to that is having family. There's nothing like having family and friends in the crowd, even though you can't see them, to like know they're there. And also for them to be able to be part of that experience as well is really special. So 2 of those factors weren't there in Tokyo, but in terms of like when the gun went, it doesn't make a difference. The only time I've ever felt the real effect of the crowd was at the Commonwealth Games, where when I was running the 4x4, you're a little bit out of consciousness in the 4x4 100-meter relay, and I was catching one of the athletes, and the crowd started to realize.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. The crowd started to realize that I was running down this athlete from the Bahamas, and all of a sudden it got louder, and I just felt like my whole body just lift up. So that was really special. But I think you're only going to get that at a home major championships. That's why I think the 2032 games, you know, I'm telling all my training partners, I'm telling as many kids as I can, like, you don't understand the opportunity that's at your doorstep. Like, train until you're going to pass out like Jemima, sit in an ice bath for 30 minutes, run up a hill and spew with me, do whatever you can to try and give yourself an opportunity to compete in Brisbane.
Fantastic. Look, and you two are absolutely part of the legacy which has already commenced since the announcement of the bid. It's people like you, the aspirational heroes of this nation, that we've got 10-year-olds now looking at and thinking, I want to be a walker, I want to be a 400-meter sprinter, I want to represent my nation, my community, my people, my family. And you know, I think that's the message, that's the legacy you two have absolutely given to this nation, and it's such a gift. So thank you so much for your time. And David, I'll hand it over to you for the wrap up.
Thanks, Sarah.
Pleasure to meet you both.
Well, I mean, I'm almost speechless. You know, what a fantastic evening. Certainly one of the best webinars we've had in a long time. And you know, just what a privilege to meet 2 intelligent, accomplished athletes and, you know, special humans. And I think as much as they've accomplished in their relatively young lives, I think you'll all agree that the best may even be yet to come, on or off the track. And it's pretty exciting to get to know these guys, and I look forward to watching their careers progress into the future. I think we can all take away some lessons that we can use in life and use in business or in both. So I just want to say thanks, to both of you, and of course to Sarah. A big part of what we do at JNF is about donations and money. I'm not going to ask anyone for any money, but we're always grateful for any donation that we get, and for people like Jemima and Steve and of course Sarah as well. Time is actually a huge commodity for them, and for them to give us their time tonight is a huge donation. Especially even in quarantine, you can see these guys are really busy. So for them to give us our time tonight, it's we don't take it for granted, and we're really grateful. Steve, you've been very coy about not committing to 2024. I noticed in words, but we hope you're there. It's only 3 years away, and Jemima, we'd love to see you race there, and hopefully in 3 years' time at least, we can actually physically be there in the stands to watch both of you race. I'd just like to thank Maccabi and the Jewish News for sponsoring the event tonight with us as partners. Just a reminder that next week we've got a great webinar on the coronavirus team in Israel that have just had a really successful trial of a new treatment in Greece that's showing a lot of promise. And hopefully, as always, Israel can be a light unto the nations and take a leading part in the treatment of coronavirus moving forward. A reminder also that on the 5th of October, we've got our annual gala, which again will be online, but we've got some amazing speakers lined up to entertain us and to inspire us. And it should be as good, if not better, than last year, which was a huge success. And in case I don't see you, and on behalf of JNF, between now and the gala, we've got obviously Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So Shana Tova to everyone. Gmar Chatima Tova. Have an easy fast and be well. Am Yisrael Chai.